You never think the people closest to you will betray you. I guess that's why betrayal hits so hard. It's not just about the lies. It's about the trust they break. My name's Eric, and up until 6 months ago, I thought I had it all. A strong marriage, a close-knit friend group, and a family who'd do anything for me. But it turns out my wife, Julia, and my best friend, Jake, had other plans. And the worst part, they thought I'd never figure it out. Julia and I had been married for 8 years. She was beautiful, ambitious, and always the center of attention at any gathering. I loved her fire, that's what drew me to her in the first place. But looking back, I realize her charm was just a mask. Jake had been my best friend since college. He was the kind of guy who could make anyone laugh, always the life of the party. He'd been my best man at our wedding, had celebrated every milestone with us, and even helped us move into our house. They both played their roles perfectly. Too perfectly. Started with small things. Julia started going out more, claiming she was meeting friends from work. Jake, who was always around, suddenly seemed harder to pin down. There were strange glances between them at family gatherings, jokes that felt too intimate. I brushed it off at first. After all, Julia and Jake were like family, they'd always been close. But something about it started gnawing at me. The turning point came one night when Julia left her phone on the counter while she was in the shower. Normally, I wouldn't snoop, but a notification popped up from Jake. Jake, last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. My heart stopped. I didn't confront her right away. I knew Julia was a smooth talker, capable of flipping any argument to her advantage. And Jake? He was just as slippery. If I was going to do this, I needed proof. The next day, I installed a tracking app on Julia's phone and set up a hidden camera in the living room. I also started paying closer attention to her behavior, when she left, who she called, and how long she was gone. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. 2 weeks later, Julia told me she was heading out for a work dinner. She kissed me on the cheek like everything was normal, but I wasn't fooled. I tracked her location to a hotel downtown. That night, I watched the footage from the hidden camera. Sure enough, Jake had come over while I was at work earlier that day. The way they acted, laughing, touching, completely at ease, it was like they'd done it 100 times before. When they kissed, I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. The betrayal wasn't just between Julia and Jake. It was a stab in the back from 2 people I trusted most. But instead of confronting them in a fit of rage, I decided to play the long game. Julia thought she was clever. Jake thought he was untouchable. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The opportunity for revenge came sooner than I expected. Julia's younger sister, Natalie, had always been the quiet one in the family. While Julia was outgoing and fiery, Natalie was reserved and thoughtful, with a warmth that Julia lacked. She'd recently moved back to town after finishing grad school and had been staying with us while she looked for a place of her own. One evening, while Julia was working late, Natalie and I ended up having dinner together. We talked about everything. Her plans, my work, even Julia. "I've noticed she's been distant lately," Natalie said, frowning. "Is everything okay between you two?" For a moment, I considered brushing her off, but something about Natalie's sincerity made me pause. "She's been different," I admitted, "but I think I'll figure it out." Natalie gave me a small, understanding smile. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Her kindness hit me harder than I expected. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Julia continued her lies, and I continued gathering evidence. Meanwhile, Natalie and I grew closer. She was a breath of fresh air, genuine, funny, and completely unlike her sister. One night, while Julia was out, Natalie and I ended up watching a movie together. Halfway through, she turned to me and said, "You seem different lately, like you're carrying something heavy." I looked at her, unsure if I should say what I'd been holding back. Finally, I took a deep breath. "Natalie, there's something you need to know about your sister." Her eyes widened. "What is it?" I told her everything. About Julia, about Jake, about the lies and betrayal. Natalie listened in stunned silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "I can't believe she'd do that to you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "To us, to the family." That night, something shifted between us. Natalie wasn't just angry for me, she was angry for herself, for their parents, for everyone Julia's betrayal had touched. And as we talked late into the night, I realized something else. Natalie wasn't just supportive, she was interested in me, and I was interested in her. The next day, I put the final pieces of my plan into motion. Julia and Jake had betrayed me, but they'd underestimated just how far I was willing to go to make them pay. And with Natalie by my side, I knew exactly how to do it. After Natalie and I talked that night, something changed between us. There was no denying the connection we had, but neither of us said it out loud, not yet. I knew acting on those feelings too soon would muddy the waters of what I needed to do next. Revenge wasn't just about satisfaction, it was about precision. Julia and Jake thought they were untouchable. I was about to show them just how wrong they were. The first step in my plan was gathering all the evidence I'd collected and organizing it: videos, text messages, GPS logs. Every detail of their betrayal was neatly stored on a USB drive. I wasn't just going to confront them, I was going to expose them to everyone who mattered in their lives. But first, I needed to set a trap. A few days later, I pretended to leave for work as usual. But instead of heading to the office, I parked a few blocks away and waited. Sure enough, Julia and Jake's familiar routine played out. Jake pulled into the driveway an hour after I left, and Julia let him in with that sickeningly warm smile she used to reserve for me. I watched through the hidden camera feed as they settled into the living room, laughing and acting like they didn't have a care in the world. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm. This time I was ready. Natalie came home from running errands just as Jake was leaving. I caught her in the hallway, her expression tense. "He was here, wasn't he?" she asked, crossing her arms. I nodded. "He's always here when I'm gone, but I think it's time to put an end to this." Natalie's eyes flashed with determination. "What's the plan?" Her willingness to help threw me for a moment. Natalie wasn't just angry, she was ready to take action. And something about having her on my side made me feel stronger. "We're going to ruin them," I said simply. The next phase of my plan involved a family dinner Julia had planned for the weekend. She'd invited her parents, Natalie, and even Jake under the guise of a casual get-together. The sheer audacity of it was mind-boggling, but it gave me the perfect stage to deliver the ultimate humiliation. I made sure Natalie was in on the plan, and she played her part beautifully. Julia's been talking about how much this dinner means to her. Natalie told me that morning, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "She really thinks everything's fine, doesn't she?" "She won't by the end of the night," I replied. When the evening arrived, Julia was the perfect hostess, laughing and chatting with her parents while Jake played his usual charming role. The two of them were masters at pretending nothing was wrong, but their little bubble was about to burst. After dinner, as we sat around the table, I stood up and cleared my throat. "There's something I need to share with everyone," I said, my voice calm but firm. Julia froze, her smile faltering. "Eric, what are you doing?" "You'll see," I replied, pulling out my laptop and connecting it to the TV. "What's going on?" her father asked, glancing between us. "I've been doing some investigating," I said, navigating to the folder labeled Julia and Jake. "And I think it's time everyone here knows the truth." The first video played showing Julia and Jake kissing in our living room. The room fell silent except for the sound of the recording. Julia's parents stared at the screen in shock, while Natalie shot me a look of encouragement. Julia jumped to her feet, her face pale. "Eric, stop this right now." "Why?" I asked, my voice icy. "Afraid of the truth?" Jake stood as well, his usual smug grin replaced with panic. "Eric, let's talk about this privately." "Privately," I repeated, laughing bitterly. You didn't seem to care about privacy when you were sneaking around with my wife." Julia's mom covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Her father's face turned red with anger. "Is this true, Julia?" he demanded. Julia stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Jake, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. When the video's finished, I turned to Julia. "You've been lying to me, to your family, to everyone." "And you," I said, pointing at Jake. "You're nothing but a coward who betrayed his best friend." Jake tried to speak, but I cut him off. "Save it. We're done here." As Julia's parents berated her and Jake stumbled over a half-hearted apology, I caught Natalie's eye. She nodded slightly, her expression calm but resolute. The dinner ended with Julia storming out, her parents refusing to speak to her, and Jake slinking away like a whipped dog. But the night wasn't over. After everyone left, Natalie and I sat in the quiet house, the tension finally breaking. "You handled that perfectly," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Couldn't have done it without you," I replied. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Julia and Jake were exposed. Their lies laid bare for everyone to see. But as I looked at Natalie, I realized something else. My focus wasn't just on revenge anymore. I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The house felt different after the dinner. Lighter, maybe. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't holding in the weight of Julia and Jake's betrayal. It was out in the open and they were left to deal with the fallout. But the biggest surprise of that night wasn't Julia's tears or Jake's feeble attempts at apologies. It was Natalie. Natalie had always been the quiet, supportive one in the family. But the way she stood by me during all this, it was more than I could have asked for. And that's when things started to shift. In the days following the dinner, Julia moved in with a friend, too embarrassed to face her parents or anyone else. Jake, I heard he was keeping a low profile after being iced out by most of our mutual friends. I wasn't concerned about either of them. I had bigger things on my mind. Natalie had stayed with me that first night after the confrontation. "In case you need someone to talk to," she'd said. But it quickly became clear that we both enjoyed each other's company far more than we'd expected. One night, as we sat on the couch, the TV playing some mindless sitcom in the background, Natalie turned to me with a curious look. "Do you feel relieved now that everything's out in the open?" she asked. I nodded, taking a sip of my beer. "Relieved, yeah. But also, I don't know, kind of lost. 8 years is a long time to spend with someone, even if it was all a lie in the end." She placed a hand on my arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "You're not lost, Eric. You're free. And honestly, you're handling this way better than most people would." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Thanks, Natalie. That means a lot." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. "She doesn't deserve you, you know," she said softly. I looked at her, catching the way her cheeks flushed slightly as she realized what she just said. "You think so?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I know so," she replied, her voice steady now. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Natalie wasn't just kind or supportive. She was real, genuine in a way Julia had never been. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I thought was long gone: hope. The next day, I decided to take a step forward. "Hey, Natalie," I said as we sat down for breakfast. "You've done a lot for me these past few weeks. And I want to thank you." She looked up from her coffee, surprised. "You don't have to thank me, Eric. Family takes care of each other." "Even when the rest of the family's a mess?" I asked, smirking. She laughed, especially then. "Well, I still want to do something for you. How about dinner?" My treat. Her eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. But then she smiled. "I'd like that." We went to a cozy little Italian place downtown. Nothing fancy, but the kind of spot where you could actually have a conversation without yelling over the music. Over pasta and wine, Natalie opened up in a way she never had before. She talked about her struggles with always being in Julia's shadow, about how their parents had unintentionally favored her older sister, and how she'd always felt like the afterthought in the family. "I guess that's why I wanted to help you," she said, twirling her fork absently. "I know what it's like to be overlooked, to feel like someone else's bad decisions are dragging you down." I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "You're not an afterthought, Natalie. Not to me." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. The drive home was quiet, but not awkward. There was a tension between us now, but it wasn't the kind that made you uncomfortable. It was the kind that made your heart race. When we pulled into the driveway, Natalie hesitated before getting out of the car. "Eric," she said, her voice soft, "thank you for tonight. I didn't realize how much I needed this." "Me too," I admitted. For a moment, we just looked at each other. The air between us charged with unspoken words. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and kissed her. She froze for a split second, then kissed me back, her hands gently resting on my face. When we pulled away, she looked at me, her cheeks flushed. "What does this mean?" "It means," I said, my voice steady, "that I'm done living in the shadow of someone else's lies, and I think you are too." That night, for the first time in months, I felt whole again. Natalie and I didn't just share a kiss. We shared an understanding, a promise to leave the past behind and build something better. But the best part, Julia had no idea what was coming next. The kiss with Natalie changed everything. For the first time since discovering Julia's betrayal, I felt like I had something to look forward to. But this wasn't just about moving on, it was about making sure Julia understood the full weight of her actions. Natalie and I agreed to keep things quiet for now. It wasn't just about avoiding unnecessary drama, it was about controlling the narrative. We both knew Julia would lash out if she found out too soon, and I wasn't ready to give her the satisfaction of disrupting something that was finally good in my life. But that didn't mean I wasn't preparing for the day it all came to light. A week later, Julia showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing on the porch, looking disheveled and uncertain. "Eric," she said, her voice tentative. "Can we talk?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want, Julia?" "I miss you," she blurted out, tears welling in her eyes. "I made a mistake. Jake meant nothing to me. I was stupid, okay? Please, let's fix this." I stared at her, trying to process the audacity of her words. After everything she'd done, she really thought she could just waltz back into my life with a half-baked apology? "There's nothing to fix," I said coldly. "You destroyed this marriage the moment you decided to betray me, and don't think for a second that I'll ever take you back." Her tears turned to anger. "So that's it, 8 years, and you're just throwing it all away?" "I'm not throwing anything away," I snapped. "You did that, and now you get to live with the consequences." I closed the door in her face. Her protests muffled as I locked the deadbolt. Later that evening, Natalie found me in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. "Julia came by, didn't she?" she asked, her voice quiet. I nodded, taking a sip. "She wanted to fix things." Natalie scoffed, typical. "She only cares because she's losing control." I looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. She's about to lose a lot more. The next day, I decided it was time to turn up the heat. Julia and Jake thought they'd gotten away with minimal damage, but I wasn't done yet. First, I reached out to a mutual friend of ours, someone I knew couldn't resist a juicy piece of gossip. I casually mentioned that Julia had been spending a lot of time with Jake lately, and that things were getting messy. By the end of the day, the story had spread like wildfire. Julia's friends were texting me for confirmation, while Jake was apparently fielding angry calls from his girlfriend, who hadn't known about his affair. Meanwhile, Natalie and I continued to grow closer. We spent our evenings talking, laughing, and finding comfort in each other's company. She was everything Julia wasn't: kind, selfless, and honest. One night, as we sat on the porch, Natalie turned to me, her expression serious. "Do you think we're making a mistake?" she asked. "With us?" I asked, frowning. She nodded. "I mean, Julia's my sister. She's awful, but she's still family. I don't want this to feel like revenge." I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers with hers. "This isn't revenge, Natalie. This is us finding something good in the middle of all this mess. Don't let Julia take that away from us." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "You always know what to say." The real fireworks came 2 weeks later at a party Julia and I had both been invited to. It was a mutual friend's birthday, and despite everything, Julia had decided to show up. Natalie and I had talked about whether we should go, but in the end, we decided it was time to stop hiding. When we walked into the party together, hand in hand, the room fell silent. Julia was standing near the bar, a drink in her hand, her face twisting into a mix of shock and fury. "Eric," she said, storming toward me. "What the hell is this?" I squeezed Natalie's hand, my expression calm. This is me moving on. "With my sister?" she hissed, her voice rising. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, "because unlike you, Natalie knows what loyalty means, and she doesn't treat people like disposable toys." The room was dead silent, everyone watching the scene unfold. Julia opened her mouth to retort, but couldn't seem to find the words. Natalie, to her credit, held her ground. "You brought this on yourself, Julia," she said, her voice firm. "You cheated, you lied, you have no one to blame but yourself." Julia turned on her heel and stormed out, her face red with humiliation. That night, as Natalie and I drove home, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Julia and Jake were out of my life, and I'd exposed them for the selfish, deceitful people they were. And now, for the first time in years, I felt like I had something real. "Thank you," I said to Natalie as we pulled into the driveway. "For what?" she asked, smiling. "For being there when I needed someone most," I said. "For reminding me that not everything is broken." She leaned over and kissed me, her touch soft but full of promise. "Here's to new beginnings," she said. I couldn't have said it better myself. The days after the party were quieter, almost peaceful. Julia's reaction had been as explosive as I'd expected, but I'd made my point. The people closest to us now knew the truth about her betrayal, and for once, she couldn't twist the narrative in her favor. I wasn't naive enough to think she'd give up completely, though. Julia always had a flair for drama, and I knew she'd try to make herself the victim in some circles. But honestly, I didn't care. I was done letting her live rent-free in my head. Now, my focus was on the future with Natalie. A week after the party, Natalie and I decided it was time to sit down with her parents and tell them everything. They'd been supportive since the fallout with Julia, but we knew this would be a delicate conversation. We met them at their favorite diner, a cozy little spot where we'd shared countless family breakfasts over the years. The nostalgia of the place wasn't lost on me as we sat down across from them, Natalie's hand gripping mine under the table. Her mom, Susan, noticed immediately. "Are you two?" she began, trailing off as she looked between us. "Yes," Natalie said firmly, her voice steady. "We're together." Her dad, Bill, frowned, but not in anger, more like confusion. "How long has this been going on?" I decided to step in. "It's recent," I said, "but I want you both to know it's not something we rushed into. We've both been through a lot, and it feels right." Susan sighed, her expression softening. "I can't say I'm not surprised, but after what Julia did, I can't exactly blame you two for finding comfort in each other." Bill nodded slowly. "You're adults, you make your own choices. Just be careful. Julia's not going to take this well." We thanked them for their understanding, and as we left the diner, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Their approval wasn't necessary, but it meant the world to Natalie, and that was enough for me. As expected, Julia didn't take the news well. 2 days after our conversation with her parents, she showed up at my house, banging on the door like a lunatic. "Eric," she yelled, "open the damn door." I sighed, running a hand through my hair before opening the door just enough to face her. "What do you want, Julia?" I asked, my tone flat. Her eyes were wild, her face flushed with anger. "You're with Natalie, my sister. Have you completely lost your mind?" "No," I said calmly. "I found it, actually. For the first time in years, I'm with someone who actually respects me." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something almost like regret crossing her face. "We were married, Eric. We had a life together, and you destroyed it," I said, my voice cold. "You chose Jake. You chose Lisa. Now, I'm choosing to move on with someone who deserves me." She opened her mouth to argue, but I shut the door in her face. Her shouting continued for a few minutes before she finally gave up and left. The rest of Julia's life continued its downward spiral. Jake ghosted her not long after the party, and most of her friends distanced themselves when the full extent of her betrayal became public. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved out of town, taking a job in a city far enough away that she wouldn't have to face her former social circle. Good riddance. Meanwhile, Natalie and I grew closer every day. What started as a mutual bond forged in shared pain became something deeper, something real. She wasn't just my partner. She was my best friend, my biggest supporter, and the person who made me believe in love again. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, I turned to her, my heart full. "You know, if you hadn't been here, I don't know how I would have gotten through all of this," I said. She smiled, her eyes shining. "I think we helped each other, Eric, and maybe this is how it was always supposed to be." I kissed her, my doubts and fears fading away with each passing moment. It's been 6 months since Julia left, and I haven't looked back. Natalie and I are building something new together, something real. To anyone reading this, betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of something better.